So, what are the seeds of tactical destruction? Well, there's a couple seeds here. One of the seeds is that black has a wonderful discovered check here along the a5 to e1 diagonal. And we can also see that the rook is blocking in the black king. In fact, if the knight was not on f4, rook to e2 would be checkmate already. Now, the knight is guarding e2, so one of the moves that you'd think of maybe playing would be something like g5 to remove the guard. If he moves the knight to a random square, then you can checkmate him. But that doesn't work, because after g5, white can play check and get rid of the rook. So that doesn't work. In fact, white could also just take en passant, in which case black hasn't achieved anything either. So g5 would not be the answer. Well, we can look at all the discoveries. And usually when you have discoveries like this, you want to start with the double checks, because the double checks force the king to move. Otherwise, he might have c3 sacking a pawn and just running away and just losing a pawn. And we'd like to win maybe more than a pawn here. So let's look at knight to b1 check. All right, well, white can certainly play c3, can't play c3 as we just said because the king's in double check. So he'd have to play here, and now again we'd love to play rook to e1 mate, but rook takes e1, so rook, that's not safe. And now the only other check that black can play would be check here and king here, and that forces a repetition. And since black's obviously in an advantageous position, he doesn't want to draw. So knight b1 check doesn't look very promising. Let's look at the other double check, knight to e4 double check. Well, if king to d1 now, knight f2 is checkmate. So that's good. So the only other move is he could play king here, and now knight check will win the rook. So that's probably sufficient to win the game. So that looks like a possible solution, that knight e4 double check. All right, and actually I was the one who moved the rook, and I'll explain that in a second. All right, so that's a perfectly good solution then. Knight e4 check, followed by either knight f2 mate or knight g3 check, winning the rook. The intended solution, though, is a beautiful checkmate. And what you do is you get the knight to interfere with that square. You play rook to e2 check. You're always looking at your checks, captures, and threats. If you're one of those people who stop here and say you can't do that because the knight will take, you have to look further and say, are there any other checks, captures, and threats that might be of interest? And the answer is, of course. Now we can give this double check, and this square is not available anymore. King to d1 and knight f2 checkmate. So that's the number one solution, even though the other line won as well, rook to e2. Now in the book, they give the rook on g1, and this is even an easier double solution. The intended solution still works. Rook check, this is the answer given in the book. Rook checks, knight takes, knight e4 check, double check, king d1, knight f2 mate. The problem is, on the very first move in this line, black can play knight e2 check, king d1, and just play knight takes g1. So that's an even easier second solution. So I moved the rook to h1 so that it would be not quite so easy to just have a second solution. And anytime there's second solutions, that means the puzzle's not as good. But in real games, of course, you might have one good line and have an even better line. So here, of course, if you don't see the mate, sure, just win the rook and he'll resign, or you'll mate him anyway. So you don't want to take a chance. If you're going to see him, let's say you see this rook to e2 check and you see that it's mate in 3. All right, you shouldn't rush out and play it to show everybody how smart you are, because that's not very, very good. If you made a mistake and you miscalculated, all of a sudden you're down a rook and you can resign. So if you do see that rook e2 leads to mate in 3, I would check it about 400 or 500 times first, assuming you have time on your clock. And if it really does work, then you say, okay, rook checks, knight takes, and now I wouldn't zip my knight here right away. I would double check again, make sure it's really the right move. Of course, at this point, you've already burned your bridges because you've sacked the rook. And double check and here and mate. So that's the solution in the book with the rook on g1, and that's also the solution, when the rook's on h1 as well.